A few years ago, if somebody had told me that one of the most effective things I could do for my mental health was to go for a walk, I probably wouldn't have taken them seriously. Then I started looking at the research, and what surprised me wasn't that walking improved mood. Most people already know exercise can make you feel better. What surprised me was how consistently researchers were finding improvements in depression, anxiety, stress, and overall mental well-being from something as simple as regular walking. In this video, I want to explore whether walking can genuinely improve mental health. I'm Ian Figures, and I'd like to thank you for taking time to watch this video. If you enjoy the content, find it useful, or think it may help somebody else, consider hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who may benefit from it. Can walking improve mental health? Can it reduce the risk of depression? Can it help us manage stress and anxiety? And could something as simple as putting one foot in front of the other have a measurable impact on how we think and feel? Let's look at the evidence. One of the most impressive studies I came across was published in JAMA Psychiatry in 2022 by researchers led by Dr. Pierce. What immediately caught my attention wasn't the findings, it was the scale. Researchers combined data from studies involving almost 191,000 participants. That's important because larger studies generally provide stronger evidence. The researchers weren't trying to determine whether people felt happier immediately after a walk. They wanted to answer a much bigger question. Is physical activity associated with a reduced risk of developing depression? That distinction matters because there's a difference between temporarily feeling better and reducing your long-term risk of mental illness. To answer that question, researchers examined prospective studies. In simple English, they looked at people who were not depressed at the beginning, and then they followed them over time. Some developed depression, some didn't. Researchers then looked at how activity levels influenced those outcomes. This is one of the reasons the study is so valuable. Rather than simply taking a snapshot of people at one moment in time, researchers were able to observe what happened over the years. And what they found was remarkable. Higher levels of physical activity were consistently associated with a lower risk of developing depression. But what really caught my attention was where the biggest benefits occurred. The largest improvements weren't seen where people went from being moderate active to becoming elite athletes. The biggest improvements occurred when people went from doing almost nothing to doing something. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? We saw something similar in the longevity research. We saw something similar in the cardiovascular research. Researchers keep finding that the biggest health gains often come from escaping inactivity, not from achieving perfection. The researchers estimate that achieving activity levels roughly equivalent to about 2.5 hours of brisk walking per week with associated with approximately 25% lower risk of depression compared with being inactive. We're talking about roughly 30 minutes per day, 5 days a week. Not a complete lifestyle overhaul, just regular movement. And yet the difference was substantial. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, this doesn't mean walking is a cure for depression. Mental health is complicated. Depression is complicated. Life is complicated. There are biological factors, psychological factors, environmental factors, social factors, trauma, stress, relationships, finances, health issues. All sorts of things influence mental well-being. But what this research suggested is that physical activity may be one of the tools available to us, and perhaps more powerful tool than many people realize. Now let's talk about why. Because whenever researchers find a relationship like this, the obvious question becomes, what is happening? Why would walking influence mental health? Part of the answer appears to involve the brain itself. When we walk, blood flow increases, more oxygen reaches the brain, various neurotransmitters become more active. Researchers have also observed an increase in something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, often shortened to BDNF. Now that sounds incredibly technical, but to think of BDNF as a fertilizer for the brain, it supports the growth, maintenance and survival of neurons. Many researchers believe it plays an important role in learning, memory and emotional regulation. Walking also appears to influence serotonin and dopamine systems. These are chemicals involved in mood, motivation and reward. Again, walking isn't magical solving life's problems, but it may be improving the biological environment in which these problems are being processed. And I think that's an important distinction because many people dismiss walking as too simple. They assume that the solution must be more complicated. Yet biologically doesn't care whether something sounds impressive, biology responds to what works. Now let's take a step back. One study is one study, no matter how large it may be. Let's see whether other researchers have found similar results. And this is where things become particularly interesting. One of the most fascinating studies I came across was conducted by researchers in Stanford University. Now, this study wasn't focused on depression risk over many years. It was focused on something called rumination. Rumination is repetitive negative thinking. Sometimes it feels like the mind gets stuck in a loop. The Stanford researchers wanted to see whether the environment we walk in makes a difference. Participants were assigned to one of two groups. One group completed a 90-minute walk in a natural environment. The other group completed a 90-minute walk in an urban environment. Now, this is where the study becomes interesting. Researchers didn't simply ask participants how they felt. They also examined activity in a region of the brain known as the subgenual prefrontal cortex. This area has been associated with depression and rumination. After the walk, participants who walked in nature reported reduced rumination, and researchers observed reduced activity in that brain region. The urban walking group did not experience the same changes. Think about that for a moment. The difference wasn't exercise versus no exercise, but both groups walked. The difference was where they walked. That finding really caught my attention because it suggested maybe something special about natural environments. Many of us intuitively feel better in these environments, but the researchers were measuring changes associated with that experience. Now, researchers are still trying to fully understand why. Perhaps nature environments produce sensory overload. Perhaps they encourage a different style of thinking. Perhaps they help reduce stress responses. Whatever the exact mechanism, the findings are intriguing and they highlight something many people overlook. Not all walks are identical. Sometimes the environment matters too. On a personal note, the time I started walking regularly around my local parks and canals, I was going through a stressful time in life, both at work and in my personal life. Things were bringing their own pressures. I personally felt how beneficial it was to get out in nature, breathing in fresh air, listening to the birds chirping, watching the squirrels run up and down the trees, seeing the ducks swimming in the ponds. There was something extremely relaxing, recharging and refueling about it. I was ready to face these challenges head on, their impact greatly reduced. I can't promise this will be the same for everyone. We're all different. We all experience different types of stress. But what I can say is for me, I absolutely felt the benefits of my regular walks, and I really hope you do too if walking is something you decide to try. Back to the research. One thing that fascinates me about mental health research is how often stress appears to be the centre of the conversation. The body and mind are deeply connected. Researchers have repeatedly observed that physical activity appears capable of helping regulate stress response. Walking may not remove the source of stress, but it appears capable of influencing how we respond to the stress. And that matters because sometimes we can't immediately change our circumstances, but we can influence our responses. Now let's look at another piece of evidence. Researchers have repeatedly combined findings from multiple studies examining walking and mental health, and the results have been remarkably consistent. Walking has repeatedly been associated with improvements in mood, anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, psychological well-being, perceived stress, and overall quality of life. Different researchers, different countries, different populations, yet the pattern seems to keep appearing. Walking appears beneficial for mental well-being. Again, that doesn't mean walking solves every problem. It doesn't. But it does suggest that movement may be one of the simplest interventions available, and perhaps one of the most underappreciated. Now let's talk about anxiety, because anxiety is something many people experience at some point in life. Some people experience occasional anxiety, some people experience regular anxiety, and some people experience intense anxiety. And while anxiety disorders can require professional support, researchers have consistently observed that physical activity appears associatedly to reduce symptoms. Part of that may involve physiological mechanisms. Walking can help regulate the nervous system. It can reduce muscle tension. It can improve sleep. It can influence stress hormones. It can provide a temporary break from environments contributing to anxiety. And perhaps, just as importantly, walking provides action. When people feel anxious, they often feel trapped, stuck, helpless. Walking is movement, literally and figuratively, and while that may sound simplistic, there's something powerful about taking action rather than remaining frozen. Now let's look at another major piece of evidence, because whenever researchers find similar results in different countries using different populations and different methods, confidence in the findings starts to grow. One of the largest studies examining physical activity and mental health comes from Norway, and it's known as the HUNT Study. HUNT stands for Nord-Thornburg Health Study. But within this health research, it's considered one of the most valuable learned-on population studies in the world. What makes it so impressive is its size. Researchers collected data from tens of thousands of adults and followed them over many years. Rather than bringing people into a laboratory for a few weeks, they were able to observe what happens in the real world over long periods of time, and that matters because health isn't lived inside the laboratory. It's lived in homes, in workplaces and communities during ordinary everyday life. The researchers wanted to understand whether the physical activities were associated with future mental health outcomes. Specifically, they wanted to know whether activity levels influence likelihood of developing depression and anxiety. The studies included more than 33,000 adults who were free from symptoms of depression and anxiety at the start of the research. That's important because researchers weren't simply comparing people who were already struggling with mental health and issues against people who weren't. They were looking prospectively. They wanted to see what happens over time. Then they followed participants for approximately 11 years. Researchers were observing people across more than a decade of their lives. Over those 11 years, some participants developed symptoms of anxiety, others did not. The researchers then analysed whether activity levels appeared to influence those outcomes, and what they discovered was fascinating. People who engaged in regular leisure time physical activity had a significantly lower risk of developing depression compared with people who were completely inactive. In fact, researchers estimated that around 12% of depression cases might potentially have been prevented if inactive individuals had performed at least 1 hour of physical activity each week. Because we live in a culture that often makes health seem incredibly complicated, people assume that they need perfect nutrition, perfect training, perfect supplements, perfect routines. Yet here we have research suggesting that sometimes it's something as simple as 1 hour of activity per week can have a meaningful implication on our mental health. What it does suggest is that relatively small amounts of movement may provide measurable protection. Again, we see a familiar theme emerging. The biggest gains often occur when people move from doing nothing to doing something, not from doing something to doing everything. That distinction matters because many people become overwhelmed by health advice. The evidence from the HUNT study suggests that even a modest amount of movements may matter, and that's incredibly encouraging. Now here's something else that caught my attention. The association appeared stronger for depression than anxiety. Researchers found clearer evidence for reducing future depression risk than they did for reducing future anxiety disorders. At first glance, that might seem disappointing, but I actually think it's useful because it reminds us that science isn't about forcing conclusions. Researchers report what they observe. Sometimes the effects are stronger in one area than another. And that's exactly what happened here. The findings were particularly compelling for depression. Now let's think about what this means when viewed alongside the other studies we've discussed. The JAMA Psychiatry meta-analysis involving nearly 191,000 participants suggested that regular physical activities are associated with lower risk of developing depression. The Stanford study suggested that walking in nature may reduce rumination and negative thought patterns, and now the HUNT study suggests that even relatively small amounts of physical activity may help reduce the risk of developing depression over long term. Different countries, different researchers, different populations, different methodologies, yet all arrive in remarkably similar conclusions. That's when evidence starts to become difficult to ignore, because we're no longer relying on one study. We're seeing a pattern emerge, and patterns matter, especially when these patterns appear repeatedly across decades of research. I think that's one of the most powerful lessons from the HUNT study. They observed that the people who moved more generally experienced better mental health outcomes than those who moved less. Not perfect outcomes, not guaranteed outcomes, better outcomes. And when it comes to mental health, that's often what we're aiming for. Not perfection, improvement. not eliminating every challenge, developing greater capacity to deal with these challenges when they arrive, and walking appears capable of contributing to that process. Now, another fascinating area of research involved cognition, because mental health isn't about avoiding depression or anxiety, it's also about how effectively the brain functions, attention, memory, decision making, and focus. Researchers have repeatedly observed that walking appears associated with improvements in cognitive performance. Blood flow increases, oxygen delivery increases, brain function appears to benefit, and that's important because many people think exercise purely in terms of physical appearance, weight loss, muscle gain, body fat, yet the brain is arguably our most important organ. Every decision we make passes through it, every relationship goal, every problem, everything. Supporting brain health should matter just as much as supporting physical health, and walking appears capable of helping both. And here's something else I find particularly encouraging. The benefits don't appear restricted to young people. Many studies have observed improvements across multiple age groups. That accessibility is one of walking's greatest strength. There are very few health interventions that are free, accessible, low impact and sustainable, supported by a growing body of scientific evidence. Walking ticks those boxes. Now let's return to the step count discussion for a moment, because neuro research examining daily steps of mental health has produced some interesting findings. Researchers analysing data from tens of thousands of adults observed that higher daily step counts were associated with lower levels of depression symptoms. Again, the findings mirrored what we saw in the longevity episode. The benefits appeared to increase as activity increased, particularly when moving from very low activity levels to more moderate activity levels. In other words, going from 2,000 to 7,000 steps may matter more than going from 12,000 to 17,000 steps. The message keeps repeating itself: consistency, not perfection; movement, not obsession; progress, not comparison. I think it's incredibly encouraging because it means mental health benefits aren't reserved for the fitness enthusiast. They're available to ordinary people. Now, I want to emphasize something, because whenever people hear about research like this, they sometimes become discouraged. But the people who benefit most from walking are often the people who start from the lowest baseline. You don't need to compare yourself with someone fitter. You only need to compare yourself with the version of you that was moving less. That's one of the reasons walking is so powerful. It meets people where they are. A marathon doesn't meet people where they are. An elite fitness program doesn't meet people where they are. Walking does. And that accessibility may be one of the reasons researchers continue finding benefits. Now let's bring everything together. The JAMA Psychiatry meta-analysis involving nearly 191,000 participants suggested that relatively modest amounts of physical activity may substantially reduce the risk of developing depression. The Stanford study suggests that walking in nature may reduce the rumination and influence brain activity associated with depression. The HUNT study followed more than 33,000 adults for 11 years and found that even modest amounts of leisure time physical activity were associated with a lower risk of developing depression. And a newer research examining daily step count suggests that higher activity levels are associated with fewer depressive symptoms. Different researchers, different countries, different methods, different populations, yet all pointing in remarkably similar directions. Walking appears to be doing far more than simply improving physical health. It appears to be supporting mental health as well. And that may be one of the most important benefits of walking that most people think about. For years, I underestimated it, and according to a growing body of scientific evidence, walking appears to work, not because it's extreme, but because it's not because it's fashionable, but because it's sustainable. People can do it, and perhaps more importantly, people can keep doing it. That consistency may be exactly why it helps. Can walking improve mental health? The evidence suggests yes. Can walking reduce the risk of depression? The evidence suggests yes. Can walking help reduce stress and anxiety? The evidence suggests yes. And can something as simple as regular walking contribute to a healthier, more resilient mind? The evidence suggests yes. Walking is free. Walking is accessible, walking is sustainable, and according to a growing body of scientific evidence, walking may be one of the simplest investments you can make in your mental well-being, because the goal isn't simply living longer, the goal is helping the body and mind that carry you through life function as well as possible for as long as possible. And walking appears to be one of the simplest ways to help make that happen. In the next video, we're going to explore another surprising benefit of walking and look at what the research tells us. You get one body, fuel it properly.